In this video, we're going to be taking a look at pre-Columbian civilizations in Mesoamerica. Alright, so in Mesoamerican history, we break it up into 5 different time periods. So let's go ahead and take a brief overview of those 5 different time periods. The first one being the Paleo-Indian period. Okay, so the Paleo-Indian period, this is the time period where Native Americans first come over to the Americas. And when does this happen? You can see here on this slide I have 30,000 years ago, right, or 30,000 BCE. Now, there's a question mark here because the truth is we don't really know exactly when Native American peoples came to the Americas, right? And so there's been a number of different theories. We'll talk about one of the main ones, Beringia, the Bering Straits theory. But there's a number of different theories, and as of right now, they're only theories, right? Nothing has been conclusively proven. We know for sure that Native Americans arrived at least 14,000 years ago, but some push that number way farther back. And of course, there are a number of different tribes and nations who say that they've always been here in the Americas, that they never crossed over from another continent. And so we got to really keep that in mind because we got to look at all the different viewpoints, including the indigenous or Native American viewpoint as well. Okay, but for our purposes here in this class, we'll say that the Paleo-Indian period began in 30,000 BCE, roughly around that time period, and lasts up until 8,000 BCE. All right. Now, what are some of the main characteristics of the Paleo-Indian period? Well, for one, we have the lifestyle of the Paleo-Indians. And that is the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. And it sounds very much like what it was. People hunted and they gathered foods, and that's how they survived. That was their lifestyle. Okay, they lived in what are called bands, meaning that they lived in groups of about roughly 25 to 50 people. Okay, so we don't have large societies during the Paleo-Indian period. We have these small bands that hunted and gathered foods. Now, what were they hunting? They were hunting large game. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. For now, I just want to give a brief overview of the 5 time periods of Mesoamerican history that we're going to be looking at for pre-Columbian civilizations. So you start off with number 1, the Paleo-Indian period. Number 2, we have the Archaic period. Okay, now this Archaic period, this is starting from 8,000 BCE all the way to 2,000 BCE. And the Archaic period, some of the main characteristics of this time period is where we start to see the beginnings of agriculture take place amongst Archaic Indians, right? That's how they're known. That's the term that they know them by during this time period, okay, Archaic Indians. So we see the beginnings of agriculture taking place, and where does it begin? It starts off in Mexico, all right, in Mesoamerica. That's where we see agriculture taking place. And eventually it spread to other areas. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And so we have the Paleo-Indian period, and then following that is this Archaic time period. Next, we have the formative pre-classic period. Okay, now this period goes from 2000 BCE all the way into the Common Era, 200 CE. Okay, if you're not familiar with those terms BCE and CE, BCE means before the Common Era and CE means Common Era. Okay, it used to be known as BC and AD, but now we use the terms BCE and CE. So if you hear me using those terms, that's what they mean. Okay. Okay, so the formative pre-classic period. This is where you start to see the beginnings of what would later become the classic civilizations of Mesoamerica. And one of the main characteristics of this time period is the formation of chiefdoms. So what is a chiefdom? These are political organizations. And so you have a chief who has political control over a village, or maybe even a number of villages during this time, right? You start to see the beginning of social stratification. And what is that? Social stratification, that's when you start to see society being broken up into different classes. Okay, so during the formative pre-classic period, you have classes such as the ruling elite, you have the priestly class, and you have a commoner class, which perform a number of different tasks, meaning that they're not broken up into completely defined different jobs that they do. So the social structure is still forming during this time period. All right, but you have the beginnings of a social structure, right? A social stratification taking place during the formative pre-classic period. Okay, and so these chiefdoms, some examples of them, we have the Olmecs, right, which is known as one of the earliest civilizations of Mesoamerica. The Maya are also around during this time period. They're still forming. Their civilization is still forming during this time period. You'll start to see them really start to develop towards the end of the formative pre-classic period. You also have another chiefdom in Monte Alban, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Okay, so the formative pre-classic period, you have chiefdoms developing, civilizations are beginning to develop during this time period. Okay, so this is the third time period. The fourth time period that we'll talk about is the classic time period. This is where you have your classic civilizations. This is where the Mayan cities really start to take off. Teotihuacan is another example of a major civilization that takes place during the classic period, and this is from 200 CE all the way up to 900 CE is where you start to see those classic civilizations begin to decline. And so what are some of the key characteristics of the classic time period? Well, you're going to see major population increase taking place within these groups. You're also going to have increased social stratification, right? Meaning that their societies are going to become more and more stratified based on your position in that society, your job and your occupation, and which family you're a part of, what lineage you're a part of, depending on the society that you're in. And so you're going to see more social stratifications where you'll have an upper class and a lower class. Right? And you're also going to see major architectural achievements taking place during this time. So like Teotihuacan is a major architectural achievement that's in central Mexico, and a number of different Mayan kingdoms or city kingdoms, city-states down in Central America. And so we'll talk more about that in just a little while as well. And the fifth and final time period that we're going to be taking a look at is the post-classic time period. And so this is after the classic period where the classic civilizations have fallen, and you're going to have other civilizations come together after the classic civilizations have fallen, and they're going to be even more well organized and on a larger scale. There's a lot of military warfare that goes on during the post-classic time period. That's one of the key characteristics of this time period. And some examples of these civilizations are the Toltecs. Right, the Toltecs are going to dominate central Mexico and parts of the Yucatan. Also, you're going to see some of the first empires form during the post-classic time period. The Aztecs, we're going to be talking about them, as well as another empire we'll look at, the Tarascans, right? And so these are the 5 time periods that we're going to be looking at of pre-Columbian civilizations in Mesoamerica. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll go ahead and jump back and start off with the Paleo-Indian period, and we'll go deeper into that. All right, so anyone out there familiar with the Bering Strait theory? The theory of how Native Americans came to the Americas, right? And so this is known as the Bering Strait theory. And so the theory goes that in the Bering Strait right now, which is covered with water, which is covered with an ocean, the Pacific Ocean, this area between Alaska and Siberia, that there was a land bridge in this area known as Beringia. Okay, so the land bridge is known as Beringia. And why was there a land bridge 30,000 years ago or 14,000 years ago or whenever Native Americans made this crossing? Well, there's a reason for it. It's because during this time period, there was an ice age going on, right? An ice age. And so because it was an ice age, things were very cold, temperatures were rising high, and there was a lot of ice. This huge amount of ice at the polar caps means that a lot of the ocean water was frozen. Okay, and so with a lot of large glaciers, frozen ocean water, you're going to have a drop in sea levels. And because of this drop in sea levels, you're going to have land exposed that otherwise wouldn't be exposed. And that is the reason why the land bridge, known as Beringia, was exposed so that Native Americans could cross it. And it was very large, right? It said that it was probably around 1,000 miles long. Okay, and so it was a huge land bridge. You wouldn't know that you were walking on a land bridge. It looked like you were just crossing a piece of land at that time. Okay, and so the theory goes that Native Americans were hunting game. Okay, they were chasing after animals and hunting animals, following them, and these animals eventually led them across Beringia, this land bridge, and they made their way into the Americas gradually. Okay, it's a gradual migration. It's not like hundreds and thousands of Paleo-Indians came into the Americas over this bridge. No, it took place slowly over a long period of time with a number of different bands. Remember, we said what the size of bands were, right? 25, 50 people. Bands would be crossing over this area, hunting various different game, and eventually would make their way into the Americas, and eventually would make their way all the way through North America, Central America, and into South America. All right, and so this is the Bering Strait theory. As I said, there are scholars out there who argue against this theory. Some argue that some Native American groups may have came by boat to the Americas. And as I said, there's also some Native Americans or indigenous peoples who believe that they were always in their homelands, that they did not migrate from another continent, right? But I need to make you familiar with the Bering Strait theory because that is the most popular theory as under the scientific model that our Western civilization is following today. But you never know, that theory may be upended and revised in the future. Most likely it already has been to some degree. A lot of people are starting to believe that some did cross over on boats. We're seeing more and more evidence for that, and the time period is also being challenged. You may even see that time period of 30,000 BCE being pushed back even farther. So it's still very much debatable, okay, concerning the migration of Native Americans into the Americas. So you have Paleo-Indians arriving in the Americas, and for a very long time, for thousands of years, they live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle where they're hunting large game. Now, what kind of large game are they hunting? Well, let's take a look at an example. This right here is known as a mastodon. It is a relative of our modern-day elephant. You also had woolly mammoths that were in the Americas as well, giant sloths, giant bison, right, even larger than the bison that we have today, and other large game that existed during this time. And this is what the Paleo-Indians were hunting, right? So they'd be hunting these large game. That's a lot of meat, can feed the whole group, right? You kill one of those, it'll feed the whole group. And if you have a way to preserve that meat, which some did, some would submerge the meat in frozen lakes. When the lakes froze over during the winter, that would preserve the meat. Others may have dried the meat, and so you have a lot of meat during this time period. But that hunter-gatherer lifestyle is going to be challenged around 9,000 BCE. Now remember, I said that the archaic time period began at 8,000 BCE. Well, there's a reason for that. Okay, so 9,000 BCE, there is a major change. All of that large game that the Paleo-Indians were hunting is going to go extinct, right? And so that's why you don't see mastodons and giant bison and giant sloths roaming around the Americas today, because they went extinct around 9,000 BCE. Okay, gradually over time they went extinct. We don't know exactly what caused this extinction. There may have been a change in climate, which may have affected the food sources for those large game. Others have claimed that maybe the Paleo-Indians themselves are to blame for the extinction of those animals. Maybe they overhunted them. Maybe it's a combination of a number of different factors, including change in climate, a lack of food sources, plant food sources for those large game, as well as maybe hunting by the Paleo-Indians. But we don't know exactly what caused that extinction as of right now. But we know that the extinction did happen around that time, and because of that extinction, we're going to see a change in the lifestyles of the Paleo-Indians, and that change in their lifestyle is going to mark the transition from the Paleo-Indian time period into the Archaic period, where we start to see the beginnings of agriculture amongst some of the native peoples, right? And so that's where we start to see early agriculture taking place around 7,000 BCE. So the Archaic time period begins around 8,000 BCE, where you're going to start to see early agriculture, at least as far as we have evidence for, taking place around 7,000 BCE in modern-day Mexico, okay, in what is today modern-day Mexico. And so this is where you start to see the first agriculture taking place, and one of the first crops that is going to be domesticated is going to be maize, corn, Okay, corn is going to be domesticated. This domestication takes thousands of years, right? So corn doesn't originally look the way that it looks today. Having this big husk with all these kernels on it and the rich, nutritious food that it is today. At first, it started off very small with very few kernels, but through human efforts, right, through human engineering, you're going to see corn develop over thousands of years into what it is today. It grows, gets larger, and becomes this nutritious food that people will eventually live off of. But it takes thousands of years for that to happen. It takes place in the Tehuacan Valley in Mexico. We actually have more recent evidence that says that corn domestication took place around 7000 BCE in the Balsas River Valley, and so that's pushing the date back. Originally, it was believed it was about 5000 BCE in the Tehuacan Valley, but now we have more recent evidence that is showing that in Mexico, in the Balsas River Valley, that we have domestication taking place around 7000 BCE, right? So there's evidence for that. And so that's going back pretty far. And so you have this early forms of agriculture starting to take place, and it develops slowly over time. So corn is one of the early plants that is domesticated. A couple of other plants that will be domesticated eventually are going to be beans and squash. And so together, these are the three sisters. And you may see this little graphic that I have here. This is just something that I pulled off the net to kind of illustrate what I'm going to explain to you. But basically, the three sisters are corn, beans, and squash. Okay, they're known as the three sisters. And why? They are grown together. And this is actually a technological achievement that is done with wisdom over time. Right? The people learned that if you grow corn, bean, and squash together in the same patch in the same area, that it could be beneficial for all three plants. And so I'll explain now why it is beneficial to grow the three sisters together. Okay, so for one, you have the corn. The corn has this long, tall stalk, right? And this stalk can act as something that the beans, the vines of the beans can grow on. Okay, so the beans will grow on this stalk of corn. And the beans themselves will help all of the plants because they add nitrogen to the soil. Okay, and that nitrogen is going to act as a food source for the corn and the squash, as well as other plants. And so it makes sense to grow them together, right? It's beneficial. And then you have the squash, and the role that the squash plays is it's a leafy plant, and so its leaves are going to cause shade at the bottom of the roots around the beans and the corn stalk, and so that shade is basically going to deter weeds from growing in that area, because weeds aren't going to want to grow in this shady area because they want sunlight, right? And so the weeds are going to grow somewhere else, and that's going to stop weeds from challenging the corn, the beans, and the squash for water, right? You don't want to have to compete with weeds for water, and so the shade created by the squash plant is going to deter the weeds from growing in that area, and so that allows the water to be soaked up by the corn, the beans, and the squash, the three sisters. Okay, and so it's actually a technological achievement to grow these three plants together. It's wisdom. It's wise. It's a wise thing to do. They're not practicing monocropping like we do today. You know, kind of the point I'm getting at. There's actually wisdom in growing these plants together. Okay, together. All right, and so that's the three sisters, and that's something that will take place later. That's much later in the archaic period. It's not right off the bat. It takes time to learn that wisdom and to develop that agriculture. Okay, but we start to see the beginnings of agriculture taking place during the archaic time period, 8000 BCE to 2000 BCE. Okay, eventually you're going to start to see maize or corn being spread up into North America from Mexico. Okay, so it's going to go up into the southwest area, and you're going to have some of the tribes, we'll talk about some of them later on, but you'll have some other tribes such as the ancestral Pueblo, as well as the Hohokam. These are a couple of tribes that will grow corn, and they get this from trading with peoples from Mexico. You're also going to see corn making its way through trade up into the Midwest and eventually into the East as well, especially the Northeast. And so in many parts of North America, corn is going to be grown, but it starts off in Mesoamerica. Okay, Middle America, the area of what we call modern day Mexico and Central America. That's Mesoamerica, right? And so corn is going to make its way and spread throughout North America. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the Paleo-Indian period. We talked about how that transitioned because of a mass extinction of the large game into the Archaic period, where we have the beginnings of agriculture, as well as the hunting of smaller animals, since the large game is gone extinct. So there's a change in lifestyle that takes place there, which also is going to affect the cultures of various peoples because they start to adapt to their various locations and their surroundings, and they develop cultures based around those areas. They're not living such a nomadic lifestyle. They're living more in areas that are defined, though they may travel around within those defined areas. So that's the characteristics of the Archaic time period. Now let's go ahead and move into the formative pre-classic time period, and we're going to talk about the Olmecs.